The sky was ruptured by streaks of crimson lightning, a chaotic tapestry of unearthly storms. Commander Owen Dax stood on the observation deck of the Sentinel, humanity's last beacon of hope in the infinite void. The massive station, orbiting a dying red star, was an engineering marvel, a fortress meant to house the remnants of civilization. But as the storm raged outside, Anne felt the weight of something ancient, something malicious pressing against his chest like an invisible hand. The warning klaxon screamed through the Sentinel's steel corridors, echoing in unsettling harmony with the growl of the unnatural storm. "Commander, you need to see this," Lieutenant Tessa Vren's voice crackled through the comms. There was a quiver in her tone that Anne didn't like. Tessa was one of the most composed officers on his crew. If she was rattled, it couldn't be good. Anne descended to the control room, his boots thudding heavily on the grated floors. The hum of the Sentinel's reactors reverberated beneath his feet. When he stepped into the room, Tessa was already there, her pale face illuminated by the eerie green glow of a holographic star chart. "What's going on, Lieutenant?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. She gestured at the display. "We picked up a signal. It's not natural." The hologram flickered, showing an alien structure that dwarfed even the Sentinel. It was massive, an angular monstrosity that defied logic and design. Its surface writhed as though alive, its edges shimmering like distorted glass. "Where is it coming from?" Aaron demanded, his eyes locked on the pulsating object. "It appeared near the edge of the storm an hour ago," Tessa said. "It's not on any of our charts. It wasn't there before. Commander, it's moving toward us." The words hit like a thunderclap. Aaron's stomach churned. "Have we tried hailing it? We've broadcasted every known frequency. No response. And, sir," Tessa hesitated. "What is it?" She zoomed in on the object, and Aaron's breath caught. The surface wasn't just writhing, it was teeming with creatures, hundreds, thousands of them. Their spindly forms, glistening black like wet obsidian, clung to the structure, their many-limbed bodies moving in chaotic unison. "They're alive," Tessa whispered. "They're watching us." Before Ayan could respond, the lights flickered, and a low, guttural vibration resonated through the station. It wasn't mechanical. It felt organic, like the heartbeat of some unfathomable entity. "Commander," another officer shouted from the adjacent console. "Our long-range sensors are picking up something else." Aaron turned just as a new image materialized. It was a wave, an expanding sphere of darkness that seemed to devour light itself. The storm wasn't a storm, it was a veil hiding this cosmic anomaly. "We've got to evacuate," Aaron said, his voice clipped with urgency. "Get the crew to the escape vessels. Now." But as he gave the order, the Sentinel shuddered violently, throwing everyone off balance. The screech of tearing metal filled the air, followed by the unmistakable hiss of decompression. "Breach in Sector 12. Tessa shouted. "Multiple breaches, structural integrity compromised." Aaron grabbed the nearest intercom. "All hands, brace for impact. Evacuate non-essential personnel immediately." As chaos erupted around him, Aaron felt an unnatural chill creep into the room. He turned to the viewport and saw them, shadows moving against the backdrop of the storm. The creatures from the alien structure were no longer confined to it. They were leaping across the void, using the gravitational pull of the Sentinel to close the distance. "They are coming aboard," Tessa said, her voice trembling. "Not if I can help it," Aaron growled. He sprinted to the weapons console and activated the station's automated defenses. Turrets extended from the Sentinel's hull, spitting streams of plasma into the dark void. Several creatures disintegrated in flashes of blue fire, but more kept coming, their movements eerily deliberate. The first impact came with a deafening crash. One of the creatures slammed into the hull, its elongated limbs piercing the steel plating like paper. Then another. And another. "Commander," Tessa said, her voice barely audible. He turned and froze. One of the creatures was inside the control room. It had bypassed the airlocks entirely, materializing as if summoned by the storm itself. Its form was even more grotesque up close, its bulbous, glistening head split open to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Black ichor dripped from its claws as it advanced. Anne reached for his sidearm and fired, the plasma bolt tearing through the creature's chest. It shrieked, a sound that echoed in his skull, but it didn't fall. Instead, it lunged, its claws raking across the console, sending sparks flying. Tessa screamed as another creature materialized behind her, dragging her into the shadows. Anne emptied his weapon into it, but by the time he reached her, she was gone. The station groaned again, the sound of its imminent collapse reverberating through the corridors. Anne stumbled toward the escape pod bay, his heart pounding as he heard the creatures closing in. The Sentinel was no longer a sanctuary, it was a graveyard. But as he reached the bay, a new sound stopped him in his tracks, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the alien structure outside. It was a call, a summons. And Aaron felt it in his bones. Something had awoken. The escape pod bay was in shambles. Half the pods were gone, jettisoned by panicked crew members, while others lay smashed and useless, their exteriors punctured by razor-sharp claws. Aaron's pulse hammered in his ears as he scanned the room. A group of engineers huddled near the far wall, their faces pale, their eyes wide with terror. "Commander Dax," one of them shouted, her voice strained. "They're everywhere. They're inside the vents, the walls, everywhere." Anne grabbed her by the shoulders, forcing her to focus. "Listen to me. We need to get to the main reactor. If we can overload it, we might have a chance to destroy this thing before it reaches the rest of the fleet." Her eyes darted toward the ceiling, where the metallic clang of claws echoed ominously. "The reactor? That's suicide. Staying here is worse," Anne snapped. "We're out of options. Move." The engineers hesitated but ultimately nodded, fear replaced by the faintest glimmer of resolve. They armed themselves with whatever they could find, plasma cutters, wrenches, even a broken piece of piping. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The group moved cautiously through the dimly lit corridors, the flickering lights casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The Sentinel's automated defenses were still firing outside, the dull thrum of plasma cannons reverberating through the hull. But Anne knew it wouldn't hold the creatures back for long. As they approached the reactor core, the temperature dropped sharply, their breath misting in the freezing air. The eerie hum from the alien structure outside had grown louder, vibrating through the station like a living heartbeat. Anne felt it gnawing at the edges of his mind, whispering alien thoughts that weren't his own. "It's in our heads," one of the engineers muttered, clutching her temple. "I can hear it, like it's speaking to me." "Don't listen to it," Anne said through gritted teeth. "Focus on the mission." The corridor ahead opened into the reactor chamber, a cavernous space filled with towering machinery. The core itself was a massive column of pulsating energy, its glow casting an otherworldly light across the room. But the sight that greeted them froze Anne in his tracks. The creatures were already there. Dozens of them clung to the walls and machinery, their spindly limbs stretching impossibly long as they moved. In the center of the room stood something larger, something far worse. It was a towering figure, its form shifting and undulating as though made of liquid shadow. Its many eyes glowed with an unholy light, and its very presence seemed to warp the air around it. "What the hell is that?" one of the engineers whispered, her voice barely audible. "The source," Aaron said, his mouth dry. The towering figure turned its gaze toward them, and Aaron felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The alien thoughts in his mind grew louder, more insistent. It was trying to communicate, or perhaps to consume. "Spread out," Aaron barked, snapping the group out of their paralysis. "We need to overload the reactor." The engineers scattered, dodging and weaving as the creatures descended from the walls. Aaron fired his weapon, his shots precise and deliberate, but for every creature he took down, two more seemed to take its place. "Commander, we can't hold them off," one of the engineers shouted, swinging her plasma cutter at an advancing creature. "Just buy me time," Aaron yelled back, sprinting toward the reactor controls. The towering figure let out a deafening roar, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt. The machinery around the reactor groaned and twisted as if responding to its call. The glow of the core intensified, its light flickering erratically. Aaron reached the console and began inputting the override commands. His fingers flew across the keypad, sweat dripping down his face despite the freezing air. A countdown appeared on the display, 10 minutes to detonation. "We're set," he shouted. "Fall back to the escape pods." But as he turned, he saw the engineers being overwhelmed. One by one, they were dragged down, their screams echoing through the chamber. The creatures swarmed them like a living tide, their bodies writhing and snapping as they tore through flesh and bone. Aaron's stomach churned, but he couldn't afford to stop. He fired at the nearest cluster of creatures, clearing a path toward the exit. The towering figure began to move, its form shifting and elongating as it pursued him. Its many eyes locked onto him, and Aaron felt an icy tendril of fear grip his heart. "You want me," he growled. "Come and get me." He fired a shot at the figure, the plasma bolt tearing through its shadowy form. It howled in rage, its body momentarily destabilized. Aaron used the distraction to sprint toward the exit, his boots pounding against the grated floor. The corridor outside was in chaos. The walls were slick with black ichor, and the air was thick with the stench of burning metal. Aaron fought his way through the creatures, his weapon running low on charge. He knew he wouldn't make it to the escape pods, not with the towering figure closing in behind him. A sudden explosion rocked the station, and Aaron stumbled, catching himself against the wall. The reactor's countdown had accelerated, the unstable core nearing critical mass. The hum of the alien structure outside grew louder, merging with the sound of the reactor's imminent collapse. Aaron turned a corner and found himself in a small observation bay. The viewport offered a clear view of the alien structure, now pulsating with an eerie light. He could see the creatures moving across its surface, converging on a massive, glowing fissure at its center. And then he understood. The structure wasn't just a ship or a fortress. It was a gateway. Something was trying to come through. Aaron's comm crackled to life, and for a moment, he thought it was one of his crew. But the voice that came through wasn't human. It was deep and resonant, 1,000 voices speaking as one. "You cannot stop us, Aaron Dax. You are but a flicker in the endless void." Aaron gritted his teeth. "Maybe not. But I can sure as hell try." He turned and ran, the reactor's final warning blaring in his ears. The creatures swarmed after him, their screeches filling the air. The towering figure loomed at the end of the corridor, blocking his path. Aaron didn't stop. He charged forward, his weapon raised. As the figure reached for him, he fired a single, desperate shot. The plasma bolt struck its center, and the figure howled, its form collapsing into a swirling vortex of shadow. The reactor detonated. A blinding light engulfed the Sentinel, consuming everything in its path. The alien structure shuddered as the explosion tore through it, the glowing fissure collapsing in on itself. The creatures screamed as they were pulled into the void, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. Aaron felt the heat and pressure of the blast, and then, nothing. The first thing Aaron became aware of was the sound of his own ragged breathing. The second was the oppressive silence. He opened his eyes, wincing as pain shot through his body. The world around him was a blur of flickering lights and floating debris. He was alive. Somehow. Aaron lay sprawled in what remained of the Sentinel's observation bay. The reinforced viewport had cracked but held firm against the vacuum of space. Beyond it, the alien structure was still visible, though it was no longer the same hulking monolith. The explosion had fractured it, sending enormous shards spinning into the void. But the gateway at its center, the glowing fissure he had seen, was still there, pulsating weakly as if clinging to existence. Aaron's chest tightened. The reactor's detonation should have obliterated it, yet it persisted, defying the laws of physics. "Status report," he muttered, though there was no one left to hear him. His comm device crackled faintly, but all channels were silent. The rest of the crew, if they hadn't made it to the escape pods, were either dead or worse, consumed by the creatures. He forced himself to stand, his legs shaky but functional. The room around him was a nightmare of mangled metal and sparking wires. A body lay nearby, one of the engineers who had followed him to the reactor. Aaron averted his eyes, swallowing the bile rising in his throat. A faint sound reached his ears, a low, rhythmic thumping. It was coming from outside, from the remnants of the alien structure. Aaron approached the cracked viewport, his heart pounding. The fissure in the structure pulsed again, and something began to emerge. At first, it was only a shadow, an indistinct form that seemed to ripple like water. But as it pushed through the gateway, its true scale became horrifyingly clear. It was enormous, larger than the structure itself, a mass of shifting tendrils and writhing limbs. Its surface glistened like molten glass, and its many eyes glowed with a sickly, unnatural light. The storm outside reignited, crimson lightning arcing through the void. Aeon felt the now familiar pressure in his mind, the alien thoughts pressing against his consciousness. But this time, they weren't whispers, they were a deafening roar. "You have failed, Aeon Dax." The voice reverberated through his skull, driving him to his knees. He clutched his head, gritting his teeth against the onslaught. Images flooded his mind, visions of entire worlds consumed, civilizations torn apart by the entity's inexorable advance. But amidst the chaos, one thought rose above the rest. It wasn't just a message. It was a warning. This wasn't the entity's full form. It was only a fragment, a piece of something far greater waiting beyond the gateway. Aeon staggered to his feet, his vision swimming. The Sentinel was gone. The fleet wasn't here. He was alone, stranded, with no weapons and no way to call for help. And yet, as he stared at the monstrosity taking shape before him, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: resolve. "If you think I'm just going to roll over and die," he muttered, "you don't know me." The remnants of the Sentinel groaned as the entity's tendrils began to probe the wreckage. Aeon ducked into a nearby corridor, his mind racing. He needed a plan. Something, anything, to delay the creature's full emergence. His thoughts turned to the escape pods. If any of them were still operational, he might be able to rig one into a makeshift weapon. It was a long shot, hell, it was practically suicide, but it was the only option he had. Aeon moved cautiously through the debris-strewn corridors, his every step punctuated by the distant sounds of tearing metal. The entity was searching for him. He could feel its presence, an oppressive weight pressing down on his mind. As he turned a corner, he came face to face with one of the creatures. It was smaller than the others, its body twisted and malformed as though it had been partially destroyed in the explosion. But its eyes still burned with malice. Aeon reacted instinctively, grabbing a jagged piece of metal from the floor. The creature lunged at him, its claws slashing through the air. He sidestepped and drove the improvised weapon into its chest, black ichor spraying across his face. The creature let out a piercing screech before collapsing, its body twitching violently. Aeon didn't wait to see if it would get back up. He sprinted toward the escape pod bay, his lungs burning with exertion. When he reached the bay, he was met with a glimmer of hope. One of the pods was still intact, its outer hull scorched but otherwise undamaged. Aeon climbed inside, quickly accessing the control panel. The pod's systems were functional, but its power levels were dangerously low. Aeon scrolled through the diagnostics, formulating a plan. If he could rig the pod's fusion drive to overload, he might be able to create a focused explosion powerful enough to destabilize the gateway. "It's a one-way trip," he muttered to himself. No escape. The thought barely registered. Survival wasn't an option anymore. This was about stopping the entity, or at least slowing it down long enough for someone else to find a way to fight back. Aeon set to work, bypassing the pod's safety protocols and rerouting its power systems. The hum of the fusion drive grew louder, a rising crescendo that matched the storm outside. As he finished the final sequence, the entity's voice filled his mind once more. "You are insignificant. A fleeting speck in an eternal tide." Aeon grinned, his teeth bared in defiance. "Yeah? Well, this speck is about to ruin your day." He launched the pod, watching through the viewport as it hurtled toward the gateway. The entity's massive form twisted in response, its tendrils reaching out to intercept the approaching threat. Aeon triggered the detonation. The resulting explosion was blinding, a surge of light and energy that tore through the void. The gateway shuddered violently, its pulsations faltering. The entity let out an earth-shaking roar as its form began to unravel, pieces of it dragged back toward the collapsing fissure. For a moment, Aeon allowed himself to hope. But then, amidst the chaos, he saw it, a crack in the fabric of space, a gaping wound that refused to close. The gateway wasn't fully destroyed. Something had awoken, and it wasn't going back to sleep. and braced himself as the shockwave from the explosion tore through the remains of the Sentinel. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was the faint glimmer of distant stars. Aaron awoke to the cold embrace of the void, his body floating weightless amid the shattered remains of the Sentinel. His suit's emergency systems had activated, enclosing him in a faint energy field that staved off the vacuum of space, but not for long. His breaths came shallow and quick, each one a reminder that his oxygen supply was dwindling. The silence was deafening. The battle station was nothing more than debris now, scattered across the star field like the bones of a long-dead giant. The alien structure was fractured but still ominously present, its jagged pieces orbiting the faintly glowing crack in reality. And then, from the emptiness, came a sound. A deep, resonant pulse, rhythmic and unrelenting, echoed through the vacuum. Aaron couldn't hear it with his ears, but he felt it in his chest, his bones, his mind. It was the gateway. Even in its damaged state, it was still alive. Still calling. Aaron activated the small propulsion pack built into his suit, maneuvering toward a larger chunk of the Sentinel's wreckage. He needed shelter, something to buy himself time to think. As he approached the twisted remains of a corridor, he spotted faint lights flickering inside, a sign of lingering power. He floated into the wreckage, the jagged edges of torn metal casting eerie shadows in the dim light. His helmet display blinked with warnings, oxygen reserves, 18%. Think, Dax, he muttered to himself. What's the play here? The truth was, there wasn't one. He had destroyed the reactor, sacrificed the station, and unleashed the full force of its arsenal. Yet the gateway persisted, and the entity, whatever it was, had only been momentarily set back. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint crackle in his comm for a moment. He thought it was static, a glitch in the failing systems. But then a voice broke through, weak and distorted. Anne, do you copy? His heart leapt. This is Commander Dax. Who's there? Lieutenant Vega, escape pod, barely operational. Anne's jaw tightened. Vega. She was alive. Vega, what's your location? Drifting near the debris field, pod's beacon, intermittent, you need to. The signal cut out, replaced by a screeching noise that made Anne wince. The alien presence was still interfering, its psychic tendrils clawing at his thoughts. I'm coming for you, he said, his voice firm despite the despair clawing at him. Anne pushed off the wreckage and oriented himself, scanning the debris field for any sign of Vega's pod. He activated his suit's tracking system, but the interference from the gateway made it nearly impossible to get a clear reading. As he drifted through the chaos, the pulse from the gateway grew stronger. The crack in space was widening, its edges shimmering with unearthly energy. Aaron could see shapes moving within it, indistinct but massive, their forms shifting and twisting like smoke caught in a gale. The entity hadn't just survived. It was summoning reinforcements. A faint light caught his eye, a flicker among the wreckage. Aaron adjusted his trajectory, his heart pounding as he approached the source. It was Vega's pod, battered but intact, its external lights blinking weakly. He reached the pod and peered through the small viewport. Vega was slumped in the pilot's seat, her face pale but her chest rising and falling. She was alive. Hang on, Lieutenant, Aaron said, gripping the manual release handle. He braced himself and pulled, the mechanism groaning before finally giving way. The hatch opened with a hiss, and Aaron climbed inside. Vega stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Commander, she rasped. It's me, Aaron said, helping her out of the seat. You're safe now. She gave a weak laugh. Safe? That's optimistic. Aaron glanced out the viewport, his stomach sinking. The gateway had grown significantly since he'd last seen it. The shapes within were becoming clearer, colossal forms with countless limbs and eyes, their presence radiating malevolence. Do you have any functionality left in this pod? He asked. Barely, Vega replied. Engines are shot, weapons offline. Emergency power's all I've got. Aaron clenched his fists. They had no weapons, no backup, and no time. The gateway was minutes away from unleashing whatever lay beyond, and they were powerless to stop it. Unless. Aaron's eyes drifted to the pod's navigation controls. The engines might be dead, but the pod still had a working fusion core. A dangerous, volatile fusion core. Vega, he said, his voice steady. I need you to trust me. She frowned. What are you talking about? I'm going to manually pilot this pod into the gateway. Her eyes widened. That's insane. You'll die. I know, Anne said. But if I can destabilize the gateway from the inside, I might be able to collapse it. It's the only chance we've got. Vega grabbed his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. You don't have to do this. We'll find another way. There is no other way, he said softly. You've seen what's coming. If that thing gets through, it's over, for all of us. Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Then I'm coming with you. Anne shook his head. No. You're getting out of here. Take what's left of the emergency power and get as far from this place as you can. Someone needs to warn the fleet. Vega hesitated, then reluctantly released his arm. You're a stubborn bastard, you know that. Comes with the job, he said with a faint smile. He helped her into a suit and secured her in the pod's emergency ejection seat. With a few keystrokes, he programmed the seat to launch her toward the nearest cluster of escape pods. You've got this, Vega, he said. Tell them what happened here. Tell them to be ready. Before she could respond, he activated the ejection sequence. The seat launched with a burst of compressed air, carrying Vega away from the doomed pod. Anne turned back to the controls, his expression grim. The gateway loomed ahead, its pulsating edges radiating waves of energy. He guided the pod toward it, overriding every safety protocol. As the pod neared the crack in space, the entity's voice filled his mind once more. You cannot destroy us, Andax. You are nothing. He gritted his teeth. Maybe I am. But nothing's all I've got. The pod's fusion core began to overload, its energy levels spiking. The gateway shuddered, the entities within recoiling as the pod plunged into the crack. Anne closed his eyes, a calm resolve washing over him. The last thing he felt was the heat of the explosion, followed by a blinding light that consumed everything. Far away, Vega's ejection seat drifted through the void. She watched as the gateway collapsed in on itself, the alien structure imploding in a burst of light and energy. The storm dissipated, and silence returned to the stars. She whispered into her comm, her voice shaking but resolute. Fleet Command, this is Lieutenant Vega. The Sentinel is gone. Commander Dax is gone. But the threat isn't over. Something's out there, and it's coming. Be ready. In the distance, a faint pulse of light flickered, a reminder that the cosmos was far from silent, and far from safe.